It is our pleasure to welcome our next special guest, Henry Hoffman, creator of the game Hue. Welcome to the show, Henry.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
So as you know, we've been working on having you as a guest since last year, and you've been super busy, but we are very excited to have you with us finally.
Yeah, thanks so much for your patience. It's great to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Can you give our audience a little taste of some of your work for those that may not be familiar?
Sure thing. So I've been sort of an indie game developer for the last sort of 8 years or so now. Coming out of university, I made a game called Mush, which is sort of a mobile game all about manipulating your emotions through touch and through sort of shaking your phone and doing a bunch of crazy stuff. But then I did a bunch more experimental work. I made a virtual reality game called Aboard the Looking Glass, using sort of hand tracking. So you look through your hands into the past and the future in order to manipulate the present. But probably the game that I'm most known for is the game Hue, which is a puzzle platformer on sort of all consoles and PC. And it's all about sort of the philosophy of color and whether you can sort of alter your reality in ways that you wouldn't expect through sort of changing your surroundings. And the game is all about this character called Hue, who's a young boy, and his mother studies the theory of colors in a completely black and white world. And you go off on this sort of big adventure to try and discover her research and find out sort of why she's disappeared under these mysterious circumstances.
All right, I'm not going to lie. I've been dying to play Hue, and I've watched footage multiple times, but I kind of keep holding out for it to maybe come to the Switch. I really want to ask that question, but I'm going to ask you a different one. So let's just talk a bit about how the concept for Hue came about.
Sure. So I've got a very sort of specific way that I approach game design, and it's kind of like a mechanic first approach, where what really excites me about video games and video game design is that it's such a new medium that there's a bunch of different sort of interactions that haven't necessarily been explored yet. And I love the idea that there's all these game mechanics that kind of exist currently, but then if we kind of push a little bit at the boundaries of what games can be, there's sort of all this uncharted territory. So the way that I approach games is trying to come up with new game mechanics that haven't been explored yet, and then building out a world and a universe sort of outwards from that. And Hue started very simply, where I was in Photoshop and I had multiple layers in Photoshop, and the background was a color, and then I had just a square, I think it was, on another layer, and that was another color. And what I loved is when I changed the hue slider on the background, so it would go shift from sort of red to blue, and I had a blue object in front of it, that sort of visibly disappeared. Just by changing the hue, I was able to sort of alter the visibility of this object. And I thought, well, it's interesting that it kind of visibly disappears, but what if this object also physically disappears? And I thought there was a sort of great potential for some sort of game mechanic in that. And that's kind of the very beginning of the idea. And then I built outwards from that and was like, well, what if we have a color wheel? And what if you can use sort of an analog stick in this sort of circular motion to select these different colors? And what if there's sort of this story and this narrative sort of all based around color theory? And that was kind of the very beginning of the game. And in sort of 2 weeks, I was able to put together a very rough prototype, which still has a lot of the things that made it through into the final game. There's sort of the color wheel, the analog stick control system, and this sort of very core sort of color mechanic where things disappear when they match the background color. Yeah, and then we just went into full development and turned it into a game from there. It's amazing how much sort of from those first 2 weeks made it into that final game.
How long was Hue under development?
So it was about 2 years in development. It was originally supposed to be 9 months, I think, but we ran a little bit over.
When working on a game like Hue, did your dreams get taken over by the colorful atmosphere of the world you were creating?
That's a good question. So not so much my dreams themselves, but one thing that I did notice is that I was working on this game sometimes sort of 16 hours a day, and the backgrounds are sort of very vibrant. And I did notice that I was starting to get sort of eye burnout almost. You know, like when you get sort of screen burnout for having an image on screen for too long. I was looking at these bright colors sort of all day, every day. and it started to have sort of a mild effect on my vision. So yeah, there was definitely some repercussions for working on such a colorful game.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned color there, and we talk about that with Hue because it's so central to what that game is. But color, it seems to be it plays a pivotal role in a number of the games that you've had some involvement in. Because aside from Hue, you have Cube or even Mortal Melon that come to mind. What is the importance of color to you with regards to game design?
It's interesting because Hue is the first game that uses color sort of mechanically, sort of as very sort of core to the game mechanic itself. But I come from sort of much more of an artistic background than a programming background. So color theory has always been really sort of instrumental in developing sort of aesthetics for the games that I work on. The very first game that I made, which was the very first commercial game that I made at least, was called Mush. And that was all about different emotions. And each character, although you were able to change your character's emotions, and each emotion had a different mechanic. But the way that we were able to really differentiate those emotions and sort of transforming between those emotions was using sort of color representation for them. So like blue would be sad, yellow would be happy, red would be angry. And I think that was the very first time that we realized that color is a great sort of signifier for game mechanics in order to sort of differentiate between various states, I guess you would say.
You talked a little bit earlier about your approach to the development, but when you think of just that first initial entry into the game, are you doing that in a kind of a visual design thought process, or is your mind strictly in the mechanics? Is it some sort of blend?
Yeah, so for me, it is very mechanic focused, and it's very much about how can we introduce the player to these to this way of interacting with a game that they maybe haven't experienced with sort of before, and can we do this in a way that that surprises the player essentially? And it's very sort of mechanic focused, almost every step of the way. Like when we're introducing new mechanics, when we're introducing new levels, the way we set pacing, everything like that is sort of mechanic focused, and it's kind of we build outwards from that. In order to sort of divulge narrative and to tell story and to sort of add contextual framework to the game. So, for example, the way that I was sort of designing the pacing of the game, you would sort of go into a level, and then there would be this introduction of a new mechanic that you hadn't experienced previously, and then the next level would maybe build on that, and it would combine that with previous mechanics that you've already experienced, and then the next level would maybe add much more complexity with a bunch of different mechanics that you've combined, and then we would add sort of an action element to it, and there would be sort of some skill-based gameplay in the next level, and then what we would do is you would kind of reach the peak of that kind of rhythm of that gameplay, and we would add a lull there, and that lull would be kind of a corridor sequence where we're divulging narrative. And so it was very much the way that we designed the introduction of different mechanics that we were able to design where the narrative gets disclosed and how the story frames everything else.
See, I guess I'm thinking a lot about the combination of that mechanic within Hue and how that works with the beauty of the visual elements within the game. And at some point, you have to make a leap between, okay, we know how this game works, but what does this game look like? And that's what kind of drew me to that question, the idea of that, because the visuals on the game are so stunning that it almost makes me think that was central in some way to the design, but it sounds like you're saying that didn't come until some later stage.
No, the aesthetics and the narrative and everything was kind of developed together. But what's really interesting about the aesthetic style is that it was born almost directly from the mechanical limitations that we had from the core game mechanic. Because the thing is, you've got this game mechanic where you're changing the background color, and that background color needs to be flat in order for the sort of visual effect of objects disappearing into it in order to sort of work. Which meant that we'd already got this restriction where the background color had to be a flat color, foreground sort of colored objects have to be flat color, which meant that we were very restricted as to how do we build the environment. And that could only be black or white. So we developed these rules, these internal rules, where anything solid was going to be black, and anything sort of gas or liquid was going to be white. And that's how we would sort of differentiate between those elements. So we've already developed this very strict set of rules. And one of the struggles that I had very early on with this aesthetic, we actually took inspiration from some sort of minimalist graphic designers like Saul Bass, who designed sort of a lot of movie posters. And we really wanted to move in this direction because it was going to make it very easy for us to create a large number of environments with minimal art resource. But we ran into the problem where we're using these sort of big blocked out black areas and blocked out white areas, and we weren't able to communicate sort of diversity between the environments. Kind of, if we had a jungle themed world, it looked almost identical to the village or to sort of the electrical world. Like we weren't able to communicate that diversity. So what we started doing is taking inspiration from shadow puppetry, where they cut out this really intricate negative space into the shadow puppets in order to communicate sort of detailing. And taking inspiration from that, we started to do the same thing. We started to chip away and cut out sort of detailing out of the environment and everything else. And we ended up with this sort of quite intricate sort of shadow puppetry inspired aesthetic that, if you trace it all the way back, was born directly out of those mechanical restraints that we had from the game mechanic.
I'm going to shift away a little bit from the development of the game and just kind of ask a different question here. There's a lot of indie devs that will throw in nice support for like speedrunners. Did you ever imagine that Hue, which is the game averages about 4.5 hours in playtime, assuming that you're not collecting all the beakers and letters. Did you imagine it would have a challenge for people trying to beat it in under 50 minutes? Because I think the world record is like 40 some minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, no, the whole speedrunning aspects came very much as a surprise to me. I'd kind of designed it as this kind of slow-paced, sort of puzzle-driven game, and the very idea that people were going to be sort of racing through it was kind of counter to my initial sort of design intention. But then actually when I started seeing the speedruns and stuff post-release, I thought it was amazing what people were able to achieve. The way that they were able to break some of my puzzles in order to get through the levels quicker. It was amazing, really.
Do you want to take some of that knowledge back into Hue at some point?
Possibly not into Hue, but I definitely think that speedrunning is something that I'm going to consider much more with games going forwards. And I would love to be able to add sort of ways that I can improve that sort of speedrunning experience for speedrunners into the game itself. So
I have it on good authority that you've got some really strong feelings about accessibility in gaming and colorblindness in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of something that I fell into without really expecting to. It's kind of expecting it, really. When I first put together the prototype of Hue, we had only built it in sort of a couple of weeks, but we were going around events, sort of showcasing it very early on to get feedback. One of the things we noticed very quickly was that there was a significant subset of people that weren't able to play the game at all. They were not able to differentiate between the colors purely from looking at them. And we did a bit of research, and we realized it's because like sort of 10% of the population suffer from color blindness in some form. And we posted sort of a quick video of the game onto the Colorblind subreddit, where a bunch of people offered a ton of support. They offered us lots of advice, and we eventually got in touch with Ian Hamilton, who's an accessibility advocate based here in the UK, and he offered us sort of a lot of advice. So we ended up building our own sort of symbol system that's sort of accessible from the options menu of Hue, where you can add symbols to each individual sort of colored object and their corresponding color on your color wheel. So people that suffer from color blindness can sort of differentiate them with the secondary system. But what we also started finding is that people that didn't suffer from color blindness also turned this option on because it made it easier to differentiate between those objects. And actually a lot of people liked using that mode even if they didn't have sort of color blindness at all.
I think it's fantastic that you've consciously made an effort to do that.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and since then I've sort of given talks at Game Accessibility Conference and tried to really sort of advocate adding these features to your game. Because one thing I noticed as well is if you place value in sort of review scores, which a lot of game publishers and game developers do, if you look through our Metacritic ratings, nearly every good review mentions the fact that we've added these sort of accessibility features for players. And I think it's a real I just think it's really important that developers are aware of this, that reviewers are paying attention to it, that players are paying attention to it, and that it's going to really boost the sort of positive reception of your game.
With color being such a focal point, do you believe that a good score and well flushed out sound effects can help accentuate the importance of color and content?
Yeah, absolutely. And the soundtrack played sort of a huge part of Hue, really. We ended up releasing a vinyl that was one of my sort of proudest achievements with the game. But it was funny because I originally found this sort of musical track online, which was kind of a classical piano track. It was stock audio, I think it was. And I downloaded it, integrated it into the game, and it fitted perfectly. So we tried to hire a composer to kind of replicate that audio. And we got through various tracks, and actually none of it was really coming close. It was much too digital, and it didn't really fit the game. So I went back to where the source of that original sort of classical track, and I kind of looked at the profile, and I knew it was sort of a Greek composer. And we were based in London at the time, and they could have been anywhere in the world. But I approached them, and I was like, "We really like this track that you did. Would you be interested in doing sort of composing for this game that I'm working on?" And it turns out that this Greek composer was 20 minutes away down the road in London, and he had just watched Indie Game the movie the night before, so really wanted to compose an indie game soundtrack. So the chances were absolutely out of this world, really. But we ended up working with him for a sort of a year on the project, and it was a very sort of intimate working relationship where I was kind of building levels in his room whilst he was at the same time composing sort of the music to the game, sort of in tandem, really.
Truly amazing. It's so strange how that can work itself out.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a huge coincidence, but hugely beneficial to the game, I think.
So you spent some time working in virtual reality, as you mentioned, with Aboard the Looking Glass, which I think is a terrific concept for a game. And I believe that this was your first prize-winning entry into Leap Motion's 3D Jam. The game was developed in about 1 week. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so it was 7 days. It was 7 sort of full days of development, but that was spread out over a month because I was actually working on Hue. I just started full-time development on Hue, so I was only able to do this in my spare time.
I'm just I guess I'm beside myself with how a concept like that can turn into a reality in 7 days of work.
Yeah, it was funny because so the game Jam itself was trying to use this Leap Motion technology, which is this hand tracking technology, and I'd gone through like about 10 different ideas on paper, trying to figure out a way that I could use this technology in a way kind of that hadn't been done before. Because as I said previously, that's pretty much my way of working, where I try and come up with mechanics that haven't been explored before. And I'd kind of exhausted all my options, and I was laying in bed, and I had my hands up above my head, and I was staring into my hands, like trying to think about what can I possibly do with these hands that hasn't been done before. And I started to zone out. And as I started to zone out, I started to look sort of beyond my hands, almost through my hands. And I started to think, well, what if I wasn't looking at my hands and my hands weren't actually doing things, which is what you would expect? What if my hands were portals and I was looking through them? And that's kind of how that game idea came around. I
would imagine that your experience in virtual reality gave you some interesting thoughts about where you would take that platform in the future. How close are we to something that is truly more viable to the mass market versus where we are today?
So I think that's a difficult question. I think there's still such a barrier to entry that I think we're several years off sort of mass adoption. And I don't know. I think until sort of playing a game in virtual reality or augmented reality, for that matter, is easier and more convenient than playing it on a games console or on a PC or on a Switch, I just don't see that widespread adoption happening.
You don't think that VR could replace consoles as we know it, or they'll even expand home consoles going forward?
I think there's potential, but I think it needs to be more convenient. I think players need to be able to be like, I want to play VR because it's easier than playing on my TV. And whilst I love immersion, until it's also more convenient, I just don't see that it's going to take off in that way.
Is there a particular game or genre that you think would benefit from a VR remake?
I don't think there's anything that's not been explored yet. And what I would like to see is sort of real world games. So games like Ingress and Pokemon Go and everything else, which use augmented reality. I would like to see some sort of real world application, maybe some sort of fitness game crossover that encourages people to go out in the real world and use real world locations. I think it's been explored on mobile, but I would like to see how that could get explored in sort of some sort of mobile headset. I know that a bunch of high profile sort of platforms are working on sort of mobile headsets for augmented reality stuff. So maybe something like that in the future could be the breakthrough.
So you've been focusing on augmented reality for a bit now. What drew you to that space?
So I'm generally just fascinated with new technology. When I'm looking at game mechanics and what game mechanics can do, usually it's limited by the technology that it's kind of executed on. And I thought augmented reality is just an interesting sort of area to explore creatively, more so than maybe sort of producing sort of consumer viable products. I just think it's an interesting sort of way to explore how we can interact with media.
Can you tell us a little bit about Reality Clash?
Sure. So that's not really a big project that I'm a part of. That was just kind of a project that I got commissioned to offer some sort of consultations and development work on. But it is sort of like this massively multiplayer augmented reality sort of first-person shooter game. So I thought it's incredibly interesting what they're able to achieve on sort of a massive scale using some of these technologies. But yeah, that's definitely not something that I've been sort of instrumental in.
What is your role for that, if you can tell us?
Yeah, it's just offering sort of development support. I designed some of the AI systems and some stuff like that.
I understand the game also uses cryptocurrency. How does that work? Do you know much about that?
So that's kind of very much a different platform. I think they've got like some sort of online marketplace where you can buy into their online store, I think, and then you can play the game separately. But what I do know is that platform holders are very cautious, I think, about those sort of relationships between sort of external storefronts and sort of in-game currency. But that's kind of outside of my remit. I very much just kind of worked on the development side.
With the neat use of mobile platform cameras and backing a real-time game with blockchain, what's a neat gimmick or accessory that a system has, such as the PSVR or the PS Move, iToy, Kinect, Joy-Con, motion controls? What accessory on a system do you think could have barely scratched the surface of good use, or which do you think was or is destined to fall away as being poorly executed?
So that's a good question. I mean, what I really loved was the Kinects. There was a great game, I've forgotten what it's called, where you play as the Kinects and it maps your body, and your body is a mask. It's an indie game, and you've got these two worlds overlaid, and your body is a mask, and you kind of use your body to mask the different worlds, and you can have this little character that runs through the world. I thought it was an incredibly innovative use of body tracking. And I would have loved to have seen a whole bunch more sort of body tracking games. And actually, with augmented reality, we're kind of seeing it sort of slowly appear on mobile, where we're able to sort of body track people and use sort of real-time skeleton creation. So I think there's going to be a bit of a resurgence in sort of real-time body tracking. And I'll be kind of excited to see how that can be utilized in games.
To stay on with the kind of similarities there between the two, I also see a big divide between the Kinect, which is the third person point of view, versus what you might see from, say, a phone game where it's the first person looking outwards. And there's definitely some differences in how each of those can behave. I mean, sure, you can have a camera that becomes your third person and looks back at you with the selfie camera, but that's also a dramatically different way of using that tool than what you see in most augmented reality, say Pokemon Go, where you're walking around and you're pointing your phone and you're using the outbound look, and you're doing that from first person point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm doing some design around this at the moment. It's funny you should mention it. And the one of the main limitations with this is that you're kind of dependent on an additional person. You need to have one person looking out, and you also need to have one person that's having their body tracked. So suddenly you've got this two-person dependency. Whereas with platforms like the Kinect, you could play it by yourself in your home, and that wasn't going to be a problem. So suddenly it becomes a much more social experience, and there's going to be some challenges there as to how that translates to sort of a single player experience.
I think the game you're talking about, was that Fru? F-R-U?
Yeah, that's the game.
Now, the indie gaming development culture has undergone a lot of scrutiny over the past year, and in late 2018, it became a very hot topic on Twitter. What is your take on things like development time crunches, the pay scale, and even the business practices of some developers who have had to close their doors due to poor decision making?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. I absolutely condemn any sort of crunch culture and people being forced, feeling like they're being forced to kind of work unsociable hours. I've been fortunate really that I've never had to be part of a AAA studio or even really a mid-tier studio. So a lot of the sort of business decisions I make are just purely project based. It's like based on the game. And usually it's I'm the only person, I'm the only developer, so I'm the only person that kind of suffers from any of those decisions that I'm pretty much making by myself.
A lot of high pressure then.
yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to bigger studios, I think it's a real concern. And I think management, sort of studio management, is very much a skill by itself. I've seen it when studios go from small to sort of just mid-size, that the amount of sort of project management that you need to go through, and the processes become so much different to when you're running an indie studio. And if you take that for granted and you take your staff for granted, then sort of everything starts to slip, and suddenly you're not able to time keep, and everything kind of goes a bit pear-shaped. And I think if you're trying to foster sort of a culture of goodwill, it's really important to look after your staff and for everyone to have a really good work-life balance.
Well, I'm really worried about the idea of this still somewhat being looked at as a AAA gaming studio problem, because I think we've seen things like Telltale, who had to close their doors, which they're larger, but they're by no means a giant AAA studio in the sense of something, say, Blizzard, and yet we saw what seems to be some probable mismanagement of that studio having to close the doors the way that they did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably my scaling of studios is slightly different to yours. I feel like any company over 20 people is sort of massive in my mind. So I think Telltale probably suffered the sort of some of the same problems that a AAA studio suffers, where there's a sort of board of directors and people making decisions that are maybe financially motivated rather than motivated by sort of the long-term sustainability of the company. Yeah, and I think it's
creativity. I would say that from what I can see on very small studios, the ones that are in the size that you're talking about for being small studios, a lot of them tend to be driven by creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think sustainability and creativity are mutually exclusive. No. I think if you're creating really sort of creative content, there's going to be an audience for that, and that's going to keep your company going. I think if you make something really creative and it's really successful, and then you're like, that was really successful, let's just keep doing that, and then you just churn out clones of this original idea that you once had and suddenly becomes stale, that's when I feel like you're losing sight of sustainability and creativity.
Was developing games your dream job, or did you plan to do something else and just kind of fall into developing games?
No, absolutely. I've been making video games since I was 9 years old. We got our first family computer, I think I was 8 years old. And my father came home one day with a copy of Planet PC magazine, which is a games magazine aimed at children. And I had a copy of Click and Play on the magazine cover, which I installed, and I made something like over 100 different games between the ages of 9 and 12, I think it was. And then I got a copy of the same magazine, and it came with a copy of Blender. And then I started making 3D games using that. And I joined a fan forum for a game which I loved as a kid called Little Big Adventure. And that community really encouraged me to create a bunch of fan art and fan games and stuff like that. And then I went to university and I studied video games. So I've been making video games all the way from 9 years old up to 30, which is where I am now.
Started on a Texas Instruments calculator on a TI-81. That's where I started making games.
Very cool.
So what's next? Is there anything on the horizon that you can tell us about?
So nothing that's been announced yet, but on Hue, I did a sort of a little bit of collaboration with my little brother, Frederick Hoffman. He did some of the sort of village design and some of the intricate detailing on some of the buildings. And me and him are collaborating on a new venture, which takes some of the core sort of tenets from Hue and the design of Hue, sort of creative, mechanic-driven gameplay, and kind of applying that to a new project that's only just kind of in its infancy, really.
Before I get to our bonus question, because we usually have a bonus question at the end, and to be fair, the bonus question has almost literally nothing to do with the rest of what we've talked about most of the time, or at least is only tangential in nature. But, you know, I can't hold it anymore. I do have to ask, is there any chance that the Switch will be able to play Hue at some point in the future?
All I can say is that it's 100% on our radar, but nothing has been announced yet.
Understood. Well, I can tell you that there are a lot of people that desperately want to be able to play that. So we're kind of pulling for that. We're hoping for that, me included. I kind of want that experience to be on that platform. It's a wonderful platform, as I'm sure you already know.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there's one thing I can ask you guys and your listeners to do in order to accelerate that process a little bit. If you could tweet at Super Rare Games and hassle them to do sort of a physical version of Hue on Switch, I'm sure that would kind of potentially accelerate the process a little bit.
I can tell you right now that there are probably tens of people thinking about typing to George right now.
That's brilliant.
So again, on to that particular bonus question. So again, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with all of the previous stuff most of the times, although this one does have a little bit to do with some of that. When do we get to see a game that combines the talents of both you and Anissa together? And wouldn't the Switch be a perfect platform to debut it on?
That's an amazing question. She's actually right here next to me. She's just arrived. But, well, she's moving. 1 second. I think that would be interesting. Anissa's sort of forte is very different to my own. She's working in sort of a larger studio doing UI and UX design. And sort of the projects that I'm doing don't necessarily have a huge amount of UI and UX. But also, I think we would be terrible at working together. We would argue all the time. She's making angry faces at me now.
Tell her to say hi to the people, hi to the listeners.
Do you want to say hi to the listeners?
Hello.
Yeah, I think it would be great at some point if you guys got together to put something together for everyone. I know that the talents are a little different, but I think there's something there that could be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I do keep trying to prod her to go indie. So maybe if I can get her to go indie, then there's more of a chance.
I want to say thank you so much, Henry, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule and all of your globetrotting to spend a little bit of time with us and talk to us about Hue and about some of the things we've gone over. Is there anything else you want to share or tell our listeners?
No, I'd just like to say if you haven't played Hue, just to give it a go. Hopefully it'll be on Switch soon, but it's on kind of every other console and PC platform in the meantime. But yeah, thanks very much for checking out my stuff and having me on the show.
It's been a pleasure. And hopefully, if something does develop further on that aspect, we can have you back.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Henry, thanks a bunch, and we wish you the best.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.